Writing as an act of fear, not confidence. We usually imagine writing as a sign of confidence, as a moment when a culture feels stable enough to explain itself to the future. But history suggests something quieter. People do not start writing when everything is secure. They start writing when memory no longer feels reliable, when stories begin to change between tellings, when elders disagree, when what once felt obvious starts to fracture. Writing is not born from abundance. It is born from uncertainty. You don't press words into stone or clay because you trust the world to remain unchanged. You do it because you're afraid it won't. This is why the earliest writing we find is not poetry. It is accounting, measurement, lists. Writing begins not with imagination, but with control, with the need to fix something in place before it moves. So here is a different way to look at the first written records. What if writing didn't appear because humanity had finally figured the world out, but because humanity felt something slipping away? What if the first scribes weren't celebrating progress, but responding to loss? Because when knowledge feels stable, it lives comfortably in memory. When it feels fragile, it demands a harder surface. Why humans begin to record knowledge when they sense fragility. Across history, the decision to record knowledge almost always follows a disruption. Empires catalog when borders shift. Priests codify rituals when traditions begin to diverge. Laws are written when memory can no longer guarantee fairness. Stability doesn't need documentation. Instability does. When everyone agrees, rules remain unspoken. It is only when agreement starts to fracture that words are pinned down. This pattern repeats again and again. Not because writing creates order, but because order feels threatened. So the appearance of early records should not immediately be read as confidence. It may be read as awareness. An awareness that something once shared was beginning to split. That knowledge once passed naturally now required reinforcement. This reframes the role of the first scribes. They were not innovators. They were stabilizers. People tasked with holding something steady in a world that no longer was. What if the first written systems were designed not to expand understanding, but to prevent its erosion? What if writing began not as a leap forward, but as a response to fracture? Because the moment knowledge needs to be written down is often the moment it can no longer survive through memory alone. And that moment leaves a trace not of growth, but of fragility. What if the earliest texts were attempts to hold on to something already fading? Imagine the moment when memory begins to feel unreliable, not erased, just unstable. Different versions of the same story, numbers remembered slightly differently, practices followed without knowing why. Nothing is gone yet, but something is loosening. That is usually when preservation begins. Not to create something new, but to stop something from dissolving. So here is the question that quietly reshapes everything. What if the earliest texts were written not to explain a new world, but to stabilize a fading one? That would explain their tone. They do not persuade. They do not teach. They do not argue. They assume. They read like reminders, like instructions meant for people who already know what they're doing, but fear they soon might not. Lists instead of stories, measurements instead of myths, records instead of revelations. as if the priority was accuracy, not understanding, because understanding can survive confusion, but precision cannot survive drift. If this is true, then the first written words were not born from curiosity. They were born from urgency, from the sense that continuity, once broken, would be impossible to restore. And if writing began as a response to loss, then its timing matters, because it suggests that something worth preserving already existed before anyone thought to write it down. Which leaves us with a final, unsettling thought for this opening. What if humanity learned to write at the moment it realized that memory, alone, was no longer enough? The quiet question that reframes the entire story. If writing emerged from fear rather than confidence, then the first written records change their meaning entirely. They stop being milestones of progress and start looking like safeguards, not declarations of arrival, but warnings. Warnings that something essential was no longer guaranteed to survive, because civilizations don't write everything down. They write what they're afraid to lose. And that fear rarely appears without cause. So here is the quiet question that reframes everything that follows. What if humanity did not begin recording its knowledge when it discovered civilization? But when it realized civilization had a past worth saving? This question doesn't accuse. It doesn't explain. It simply shifts perspective. If the first texts were acts of preservation, then they were written too late to capture the beginning. They were written at the edge, when continuity was already fragile, when memory was already thinning, when the world no longer felt permanent. And that means something important. It means the earliest written history may not describe how humanity started. It may describe what humanity managed to remember after something had already been lost. This is not a claim. It's a lens. A way of looking at ancient records not as origins, but as residue. And once we adopt that lens, the behavior of the earliest texts stops being strange. It becomes inevitable, because what follows loss is not invention, it is preservation. What we expect from the beginning of civilization. When we imagine the beginning of civilization, we expect uncertainty, crude tools, imperfect systems, ideas tested, abandoned, tried again. Beginnings are usually messy. They show hesitation. Early technologies rarely work well. Early symbols struggle to express abstract ideas. Early societies argue about rules because no one knows yet which ones will last. This expectation is so deeply ingrained that we rarely question it. We assume complexity must be earned slowly, that mastery comes only after generations of failure. So when we look for the start of civilization, we look for rough edges, for learning curves, for mistakes frozen in time. And that expectation shapes everything we think we know about human history. Because if we find something clean, organized, and confident at the beginning, we instinctively push it forward in time. We say it must be later, more developed, more advanced than it looks. But what if that instinct is wrong? What if the absence of hesitation doesn't mean maturity, but memory? What if what we expect to see at the beginning is not always what actually appears when a civilization is rebuilding rather than being born? Because reconstruction does not leave the same traces as invention. It skips the experimentation. It restores forms already known to work. And if that's the case, then the question isn't why early civilizations look advanced. The question is why we assume they shouldn't, what the earliest texts actually look like, and why That's a problem. When the earliest written records finally come into view, they do not behave the way beginnings are supposed to. They are not tentative. They are not experimental. They do not explain themselves. They arrive already functional. The first texts are not stories about learning to write. They do not debate symbols or struggle with meaning. They use language as if its rules are already fixed. Numbers are standardized. Measurements are consistent. Administrative categories are clearly defined. Nothing pauses to justify itself. This is where discomfort begins. Because early writing should reveal confusion. It should expose trial and error. Instead, these texts assume competence. They read as if the reader already understands the system, as if writing is not a new invention, but a tool being deployed for a specific purpose. That purpose is not expression. It is accuracy. This creates a contradiction. If writing has just been invented, why is it immediately used for tasks that require long-established agreement? Accounting only works when everyone already trusts the same units. Calendars only function when time is already organized. Legal records only matter when rules are already accepted. So here is the problem. What if writing appears only after these systems already exist? That would mean the earliest texts are not the origin of knowledge, they are evidence of its prior presence. And that shifts the question entirely. Instead of asking how writing created civilization, we are forced to ask what kind of civilization requires writing only after its foundations are already in place. What if writing began as copying, not invention? There is a difference between creating a system and transcribing one. Creation leaves debate behind. Multiple versions, competing approaches. Copying leaves consistency. When something is copied, precision matters more than explanation. You don't ask why a symbol looks the way it does. You reproduce it exactly. You don't question the structure. You preserve it. This is what the earliest writing looks like. Not exploratory, not argumentative, conservative, careful, as if the goal was not to experiment, but to avoid deviation. Which raises a question that quietly changes everything. What if the first scribes were not inventors, but archivists? People tasked with fixing something in place before it drifted beyond recovery. If that were the case, writing would not begin with creativity. It would begin with responsibility. With the fear that memory, left alone, would eventually fracture into incompatible versions. So the earliest texts would not explain. They would assume. They would speak to an audience already familiar with the system, but increasingly uncertain it could survive unchanged. This would also explain why those texts feel incomplete to us, why they lack context, why origins are missing, because they were never meant to explain the world to strangers. They were meant to hold the world steady for those still inside it, and if writing began as copying, then what we're seeing in the earliest records is not the birth of civilization, but the moment someone realized that civilization could be lost, which brings us to the threshold of the story. Because once we accept that possibility, we are forced to ask the next question. If writing was preserving something, what exactly was already there to preserve? Chapter 1. How civilizations usually grow, and why Sumer doesn't fit the pattern. When archaeologists reconstruct the rise of civilizations, they usually follow a familiar path. Small settlements appear first. Temporary shelters become permanent homes. Simple tools grow more refined. Authority emerges slowly, often unevenly. There are pauses, reversals, failed experiments, civilizations learn by doing and by failing. This pattern repeats across the ancient world. In Egypt, development unfolds in layers. In the Indus Valley, towns precede cities. In China, centuries of regional cultures prepare the ground before large-scale states appear. The evidence is gradual. You can trace it step by step. That expectation shapes how we read the past. So when archaeologists turn to southern Mesopotamia, they expect to see the same thing. Early villages, incremental change, a long prelude before complexity. But that is not what appears. Instead, cities emerge abruptly, large enough to require planning, organized enough to require coordination, dense enough to require administration. Not one city, several. And they appear within a surprisingly narrow window of time. This is where the pattern breaks, because Sumer does not look like a civilization finding its way forward. It looks like a civilization stepping into a role, which raises the first unsettling question of this act. What if Sumer didn't grow the way civilizations usually do, because it wasn't starting from zero? If what we're seeing is not a first attempt, then the absence of a long developmental trail is no longer mysterious. It becomes expected. Reconstruction does not leave the same archaeological fingerprints as invention. When people already know what they are trying to build, they do not experiment publicly. They restore, and restoration leaves fewer mistakes behind. At the sudden appearance of coordinated cities. What makes the early Sumerian cities truly unsettling is not their size. It is their coordination. These were not isolated experiments, each inventing solutions independently. Across the southern Mesopotamian plain, multiple urban centers emerge sharing the same assumptions, the same logic of space, the same administrative needs, the same relationship between temples, storage, and labor. This level of alignment is difficult to explain if every city was learning from scratch. Independent invention produces variation, different layouts, different measurements, different mistakes. But here, the differences are minor. The structure is shared, which raises a deeper question. What if these cities were not discovering how to be cities, but remembering how? Coordination of this kind suggests a common reference point, not communication after the fact, but agreement before construction begins, as if the builders already knew what an organized city was supposed to look like. This kind of knowledge does not emerge instantly through trial and error. It emerges when people are restoring something they believe once worked. That belief changes behavior. Instead of experimenting, they replicate. Instead of improvising, they align. Instead of asking what might work, they ask what must be preserved. If Sumerian cities were coordinated in this way, then their sudden appearance is not a mystery of speed. It is a clue of intent. They were not trying to invent a new way of living. They were trying to recover one. And that shifts the weight of the question again. Because if cities were being restored, then someone somewhere remembered what a functioning city was supposed to be, which leads directly to the next point. Are shared systems and standards across distant cities. Coordination is one thing, standardization is another. When early Sumerian cities are examined closely, what emerges is not just shared intent, but shared systems. Weights match, measures align, administrative categories repeat. A unit of grain in one city means the same thing in another. A calendar reference here corresponds to a calendar reference there. This matters more than it seems, because standards are expensive to create, They require agreement, training, enforcement. You don't standardize by accident, and you don't standardize quickly unless the standards already exist. When societies invent systems organically, they argue about them. Units vary. Methods compete. Local traditions resist unification. Standardization usually comes later, after conflict, consolidation, and authority. But in Sumer, standards appear early, so early that they feel assumed, which raises a question that archaeology alone cannot answer. What if these standards were not negotiated, but inherited? Inherited systems behave differently. They are treated with respect. They are copied carefully. They are preserved even when their original rationale is forgotten. That would explain why Sumerian records often show precision without explanation, why numbers are used confidently but rarely justified, why procedures exist without documented debates about alternatives. Because debates happen when systems are new. Preservation happens when systems are old. If these standards predate the cities that use them, then Sumerian civilization begins to look less like an invention and more like a framework being reassembled. Which brings us to the final question of this chapter. If Sumer inherited its systems, who established them in the first place? And that question cannot be answered by architecture or administration alone. To follow it further, we have to look at the one document that Sumerians themselves treated as memory, not myth. A list that doesn't behave like mythology. Among all surviving Sumerian texts, there is one that refuses to fit neatly into any category we're comfortable with. It isn't a myth. It isn't a poem. It isn't a prayer. It doesn't explain. It doesn't persuade. It lists names, cities, lengths of reigns, transitions of power, line after line. No commentary. No symbolism explained. This document is known today as the Sumerian King List, and what makes it disturbing is not what it claims, but how it claims it. Mythology usually signals itself. It exaggerates openly, it dramatizes. It frames events as timeless or symbolic. But this text doesn't do that. It uses the same administrative structure before and after its most impossible claims. The same tone, the same formatting, the same confidence. There is no shift in voice between the sections that defy belief and those that align with archaeology, which creates a problem. Because the text begins calmly stating, kingship descended from heaven. Kingship was in Eridu. And then it lists rulers whose reigns stretch tens of thousands of years, not as metaphor, not as allegory, as data. Then, without warning, the list inserts a single sentence. The flood swept over the land. After that, everything changes. Reigns shorten. Cities shift. Time behaves normally again. But the structure of the document does not. It does not say, now the story becomes symbolic. It does not mark a transition from myth to history. It simply continues, as if the flood was not a story, but an event. And that forces an uncomfortable question. What if the Sumerians did not see this list as mythology at all? What if they saw it as a record that passed through catastrophe? A document that survived even when its meaning partially did not. Because here is the key detail. The Sumerians copied this list for over 1,000 years. Different cities, different dynasties, different political agendas. Yet the impossible numbers remain. If they were embarrassing fiction, they would have been removed. If they were symbolic poetry, they would have been reinterpreted. Instead, they were preserved exactly, which suggests something unsettling. They were copying something they believed mattered, even if they no longer understood it. And that brings us to the edge of the next chapter. Because if the king list preserves memory rather than myth, then the numbers it contains may not describe human lifespans at all. They may describe something else entirely. Chapter 2. When numbers stop behaving like lifespans. At first glance, the numbers in the king list feel absurd. Tens of thousands of years, reigns longer than recorded human existence, figures that collapse under the weight of common sense. So the instinctive response is dismissal. Symbolism, exaggeration, myth dressed as history. But that response assumes the numbers were meant to represent lifespans. What if they weren't? Because when researchers look closer, something unexpected emerges. The numbers are not chaotic. They are precise. They repeat in patterns. They align with a specific mathematical logic. They cluster around a single base system, a system built on 60, 3600, 7200, 28,800, 36,000, 40,200. These are not random exaggerations. They are clean multiples, deliberate ones. And this is where the discomfort deepens. Because when ancient cultures exaggerate, they exaggerate inconsistently. Heroes live a very long time. Gods rule for ages. But they do not produce neatly structured numerical sequences. Accounting systems do. Calendars do. Astronomical cycles do. So the question quietly shifts. What if these numbers were never meant to describe how long someone lived, but how long something lasted? An era, a phase, a cycle. If the king list is read this way, its structure suddenly makes sense. Before the flood, time is measured in vast, orderly units. After the flood, time collapses into human scale. Not because humans suddenly became weaker, but because the system used to measure time changed. This would explain why the list does not apologize for its numbers. It does not frame them as miraculous. It simply records them, as if the reader was expected to understand what they represented, and if later scribes no longer did, they still copied them faithfully. Because you preserve what you do not fully grasp when you believe it carries authority. So the numbers remain, not as lifespans, as markers, markers of something older than the kings whose names accompany them, which leads us directly to the next question. If these numbers describe cycles rather than lives, what kind of system was tracking time on that scale? The time measured differently before the flood. If the numbers in the king list do not describe lifespans, then they describe a way of measuring time that no longer exists. And that alone is unsettling, because timekeeping is never neutral. How a civilization measures time reveals how it understands reality. Agricultural societies measure seasons. Empires measure reigns. Religious cultures measure sacred cycles. But the pre-flood section of the king list does none of these. It measures time in units too large for human biography, yet too structured for myth. The base 60 system dominates everything, not just mathematics, not just trade, time itself. This matters because base 60 is not intuitive. It is not what children invent naturally. It is not what isolated cultures default to. It is a deliberate choice, optimized for division, repetition, and long-term tracking, which suggests purpose. If pre-flood time was measured in these vast, regular units, then whoever designed the system was not thinking in generations. They were thinking in cycles. long cycles. Cycles that repeat slowly, predictably, across spans longer than a human life. And there is only one domain where this kind of thinking is necessary: the sky. Astronomical time does not care about individuals. It moves in patterns that only become visible when tracked patiently across centuries. Planetary alignments, precessional drift, recurring conjunctions. These are not things a single observer can discover alone. They require institutions, records, continuity across time. So here is the question that begins to form. What if the pre-flood world organized itself around cosmic time, not human time? What if authority was not measured by how long a king lived, but by how long a cycle was maintained? In that context, a reign does not belong to a man. It belongs to an era, and the flood becomes more than a disaster. It becomes a rupture, a moment when one way of measuring reality collapsed and another took its place. After the flood, time shrinks, reigns shorten, history accelerates, human scale replaces cosmic scale. Not because the universe changed, but because continuity was broken, which leads us to the next step in the logic. I speak the flood as a boundary between two systems of reality. In the king list, the flood is not described emotionally. There is no panic, no moral lesson, no divine drama, just a sentence. The flood swept over the land, and then everything changes. This is important, because mythology usually lingers on catastrophe. It amplifies it, explains it, justifies it. But here, the flood functions like a divider, a line drawn through time. Before it, one system operates. After it, another takes over. Before the flood, time stretches across immense ordered spans. After the flood, time contracts into recognizably human limits. Before the flood, authority descends from heaven. After the flood, it moves from city to city, from dynasty to dynasty. The document does not frame this as a punishment. It frames it as a transition, which leads to a subtle but powerful possibility. What if the flood was not remembered primarily as destruction, but as a loss of continuity? A moment when one way of organizing the world became impossible to sustain. If the pre-flood system depended on long-term observation, stable institutions, and uninterrupted transmission of knowledge, then even a regional catastrophe could collapse it completely. Not because everyone died, but because the chain broke, records lost, observers scattered, standards forgotten. After that point, you no longer measure centuries, you measure lifetimes. You no longer track cycles that outlast you. You focus on survival. So the flood becomes less about water and more about rupture. A reset not of humanity, but of how humanity relates to time, authority, and knowledge. And this would explain something else. Why the king list insists that kingship is lowered from heaven again, after the flood, not created anew, returned. As if legitimacy once came from a system no longer fully accessible. As if power once flowed from alignment with something higher, cosmic order, perhaps, and after the rupture, that alignment could only be approximated. This interpretation does not require belief, only consistency, because the text behaves exactly as a document trying to bridge two incompatible realities. And that brings us to the next step, because if the flood marks a rupture between systems, then the post-flood world is not ignorant, it is adaptive. Why? post-flood civilization looks like reconstruction, not progress. After the flood, civilization does not restart at zero. It resumes, but differently. The post-flood world does not behave like a society discovering itself for the first time. It behaves like a society working with fragments. Knowledge is present, but incomplete. Systems exist, but their origins are no longer explained. Practices continue, but the reasons behind them grow thin. This is not the pattern of innovation. It is the pattern of reconstruction. When people invent, they experiment openly. When people inherit broken systems, they preserve cautiously. And the post-flood Sumerians preserve everything. They copy numbers they no longer contextualize. They repeat rituals whose origins they no longer explain. They build structures that echo older designs without claiming authorship. Again and again, the language they use is revealing, not we created, but we restored. Not this is new, but this was before. Restoration implies loss. It implies that something once functioned as a whole, and now exists only in pieces. And this explains a crucial paradox. Why post-flood civilization appears sophisticated but cautious, advanced but conservative, capable but reverent toward the past. Because when you are rebuilding from fragments, you do not innovate freely. You follow what remains. You trust what survived. You hesitate to change what you no longer fully understand. This is why the earliest post-flood cities look complete but not experimental. Why writing appears confident but restrained. Why astronomy is precise but not theoretical. Why law exists without philosophical debate. Because these were not being invented, they were being maintained. And that leads to the final question of this act. If post-flood civilization was reconstructing inherited systems, what kind of world existed before the rupture? To answer that, we have to move beyond cities and documents. We have to look at memory itself, at how ancient cultures remembered those who came before. Chapter 3. When myths across cultures begin to align. When a story appears in one culture, it can be dismissed. When it appears in several, it becomes interesting. But when the same structure emerges in civilizations separated by oceans, millennia, and language families, it becomes difficult to ignore. Across the ancient world, cultures that never met tell variations of the same story. A world that existed before, a catastrophe that erased it, a small group that survived, knowledge carried forward, civilization rebuilt, the names change, the symbols shift, the gods wear different faces, but the skeleton of the story remains intact. This is not how myths usually behave. Independent invention creates diversity, local fears, local gods, local explanations. Shared memory creates pattern, and the pattern here is remarkably stable. Floods are not simply disasters, they are boundaries. Teachers do not merely inspire, they instruct. Knowledge does not evolve slowly. It is given, then guarded. And crucially, the past is always described as greater than the present. Longer lives, deeper knowledge, closer proximity to order. This is the opposite of progress mythology. Most cultures imagine improvement over time. These stories imagine decline, which leads to a question that reshapes how we read them. What if these myths are not origin stories, but compression artifacts? fragments of a much older narrative condensed into symbolic form as memory stretched across generations. If a real event was remembered but its context slowly dissolved, myth would be the only container strong enough to hold it. Myth does not require precision. It requires survival. And when details fade, structure remains. That structure is what we are seeing, a recurring memory of rupture and restoration. And Sumer is not alone in preserving it. The flood motif as a shared historical boundary. Across cultures, the flood is never just weather. It is not seasonal. It is not cyclical. It is not routine. It is singular, a dividing line. Before the flood, the world operates under one set of assumptions. After the flood, those assumptions no longer hold. This pattern appears with striking consistency. In Mesopotamia, the flood separates kings who rule for impossible spans from kings who rule like humans. In Hebrew tradition, the flood divides generations that live for centuries from generations that do not. In Hindu cosmology, floods mark the end of yugas, entire world ages, followed by diminished cycles. In Mesoamerican traditions, previous worlds end in water before a lesser world begins again. Different cultures, different mythologies, same structural role. The flood is not merely destruction, it is downgrading, a loss of access, a reduction in scale. And this is where interpretation matters. If floods were only metaphors for chaos, they would be interchangeable. Fire, wind, darkness, monsters. But water dominates. Water erases without leaving ruins. It buries without burning. It preserves fragments while destroying context, which is exactly what the archaeological record shows. Layers of clean silt, abrupt discontinuities, cities rebuilt directly on top of earlier ones, not centuries later, immediately, as if survivors knew where to return, as if they were rebuilding familiar ground. This aligns with the myths. The survivors are not wanderers. They are restorers. They know what to rebuild. They know where to rebuild it. They know which knowledge must survive. This consistency across cultures suggests that the flood is not simply a symbolic reset. It is a remembered boundary, a point where continuity failed, but memory did not fully disappear. And if that is true, then Sumer's flood is not an isolated story. It is one local expression of a global recollection, not necessarily of a single global event, but of a shared human experience, the sudden loss of a world that felt stable. Which brings us to the next question. Why advanced knowledge survives catastrophe? When catastrophe strikes, not everything disappears. What vanishes first is infrastructure. Cities collapse, institutions fracture, networks fail. But knowledge behaves differently. It can be carried, compressed, simplified, encoded. Advanced knowledge does not survive because it is strong. It survives because it is selected. People do not try to save everything. They save what they believe will allow rebuilding. Navigation, agriculture, measurement, calendars, construction principles. Not theories, tools. This explains a paradox that appears again and again in post-catastrophe cultures. They retain sophisticated techniques but lose the explanations behind them. They know how but no longer fully remember why, which creates a specific signature in history. Precision without theory, practice without origin stories, systems treated as sacred because their logic is no longer transparent. This is exactly what we see in early post-flood civilizations, mathematics that works but is not philosophically justified, astronomy that predicts but does not theorize, architecture that endures but is never claimed as invention. This is the fingerprint of inherited knowledge, and inherited knowledge behaves conservatively. You do not improve what you fear breaking. You repeat it faithfully. You ritualize it. You attach authority to it. This is why teachers become gods, why instructions become commandments, why techniques acquire mythic origins. Not because people were naive, but because reverence protects accuracy. So the question becomes sharper. What level of knowledge existed before the rupture that was worth preserving at all costs? Because only certain kinds of knowledge are chosen to survive disaster, and the choice tells us what mattered most. Teachers, gods, and the memory of instruction. When knowledge survives catastrophe, its carriers are remembered, but rarely accurately. Over time, teachers become ancestors. Ancestors become heroes. Heroes become gods. This is not myth-making out of imagination. It is memory losing resolution. In Sumerian texts, those who bring knowledge are never abstract forces. They teach specific things: how to measure land, how to track the stars, how to regulate labor, how to build temples that align with the sky. They are not creators of reality. They are instructors. This distinction matters. Creation myths usually explain existence. Instruction myths explain procedure. And Sumerian accounts are procedural. They describe beings who arrive, organize, assign roles, correct mistakes, and leave behind systems that must be maintained. The language is administrative, not mystical, which suggests something subtle. What if the gods in these stories are not metaphors for natural forces, but placeholders for remembered authority? When a culture no longer understands how knowledge originally entered its world, it elevates the source, not to deceive, but to protect, because divine origin discourages alteration. If a technique comes from a god, you don't modify it casually, you preserve it. And preservation is exactly what post-flood cultures needed. This reframes the role of the gods, not as creators of humanity, but as guarantors of continuity, figures whose authority ensures that inherited systems remain intact, even when understanding fades. And this explains another pattern that repeats across cultures. The gods withdraw. They do not stay. They establish order, then retreat. Because memory does not need constant presence. It needs transmission. And once instruction is complete, myth takes over where history ends, which leads us to the next and most dangerous question. The chapter 4, when knowledge becomes a threat. There is a moment in every long cycle when knowledge stops being stabilizing and starts becoming dangerous. Not because it is false, but because it is powerful. In the earliest myths, knowledge is not neutral. It changes hierarchy. It redistributes control. It accelerates capability. And acceleration destabilizes systems that depend on balance. This is where the tone of ancient memory shifts. The teachers who once guided become figures of concern. The same beings who gave instruction are later described as limited, restrained, or removed. Access changes. Knowledge becomes segmented, restricted, ritualized. In Sumerian tradition, this shift is subtle, but present. Certain knowledge is described as me, divine decrees, principles of order. They are not freely distributed. They are guarded, stored in temples, handled by trained specialists. This suggests something important. What if advanced knowledge was not lost accidentally, but intentionally contained? Because after catastrophe, speed matters. Rebuilding too quickly can recreate the conditions that led to collapse. So control becomes survival. Knowledge is no longer shared openly. It is curated, given in portions, wrapped in ritual, filtered through authority. This is not suppression. It is pacing. And pacing implies memory of failure, which leads to an uncomfortable possibility. What if the pre-flood world collapsed not only because of environmental forces, but because it crossed a threshold it could not manage? And if that threshold was crossed once before, then those who remembered it would do everything possible to prevent it from happening again, including limiting how much could be remembered. The cycles of advancement and restraint. If knowledge was once powerful enough to destabilize the world, then restraint would not be accidental. It would be designed. Cycles would emerge. Periods of growth, periods of consolidation, moments where advancement slows, not because curiosity fades, but because memory intervenes. This pattern appears quietly beneath the surface of ancient history. After sudden leaps, there are plateaus. After expansions, there are pauses. Civilizations rise quickly, then stabilize for centuries without significant technological acceleration. This is often explained as stagnation, but stagnation implies failure. What if it was intention? What if ancient societies learned that unbounded progress carries risk? That certain thresholds, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. In that context, slowing down becomes wisdom. You preserve what works. You ritualize what matters. You discourage experimentation in areas that once proved dangerous. This could explain why early advanced knowledge often remains strangely static. Astronomical systems that remain unchanged for millennia. Architectural principles repeated without innovation. Mathematical frameworks preserved rather than expanded. Not because people were incapable of innovation, but because innovation was no longer the priority. Survival was. And survival favors balance over speed. If this cycle existed before and ended in catastrophe, then the post-flood world would be cautious by design. Advancement would resume, but within boundaries. Boundaries enforced not by technology, but by culture, by myth, by taboo, by divine authority. And that leads us to the final question of this chapter. Was the collapse remembered as a warning? Warnings do not always arrive as instructions. Sometimes they survive as stories. When a civilization experiences collapse, it does not always record causes directly. Trauma resists clarity. Instead, meaning is compressed. Responsibility becomes allegory. Failure becomes myth. Mistakes are transformed into moral boundaries. This is how memory protects itself. Across ancient traditions, collapse is rarely framed as random. It follows transgression. Too much knowledge, too much reach, too little restraint. Humans build too high. Speak what should remain unsaid. Cross a boundary they do not yet understand. The result is always the same. Loss, reset, silence. These are not comforting stories. They are cautionary ones, and they appear in cultures that had no contact with one another, which suggests they are not inventions. but inheritances? What if the collapse of the pre-flood world was remembered not just as an event, but as a lesson encoded deeply enough that it shaped behavior long after details faded? This would explain why advanced knowledge is surrounded by taboo, why access is restricted, why priests guard information, why scribes copy without altering, why innovation slows at critical thresholds, because innovation is not neutral when memory contains failure, and so the collapse is not merely history, it becomes guidance, a shadow that follows every generation, whispering the same instruction: do not repeat this. And if that shadow guided ancient societies, then it raises the most unsettling question of all. Chapter 5. Are we approaching the same threshold? Again? If every civilization believes its moment is unique, that its technologies are unprecedented, that its challenges are unlike anything before, that history has finally broken free from repetition. But from a longer view, patterns begin to surface. Acceleration, centralization of knowledge, tools that reshape power faster than ethics can adjust. These are not new conditions. They are familiar ones. What changes is the scale. Today, knowledge moves instantly. Systems interlock globally. Failures propagate faster than any flood ever could. And once again, we find ourselves at a threshold, not defined by water, but by capacity. Artificial intelligence, nuclear energy, biotechnological intervention, planetary scale engineering. These are not incremental tools. They are transformational, and transformation without restraint has appeared in this story before. So the question becomes impossible to avoid. What if the ancient warnings were never about the past, but about us? What if the reason so many civilizations remembered collapse was not to explain where they came from, but to signal where unchecked advancement leads? This does not require belief in lost super-civilizations, only recognition of pattern. Systems grow, they concentrate power, they cross thresholds, they destabilize, and when restraint fails, the reset follows, sometimes by nature, sometimes by conflict, sometimes by cascading systems. Collapse. The mechanism changes. The outcome does not, which forces us to confront the final implication of everything we've traced. Now, the question that remains, the Sumerians did not tell us who they were. They told us what they remembered. They recorded a world divided into before and after. They preserved systems they believed predated them. They treated knowledge as inheritance, not discovery. And they warned, quietly, that continuity can be broken. The most important question was never whether ancient gods were real. It was this: what if humanity has reached this point before and failed? And if that is true, then history is not asking us to look backward. It is asking whether we will recognize the moment when progress once again becomes dangerous. Because the real secret hidden in the oldest texts is not about the past, it is about choice. Whether this cycle ends the same way or finally breaks.